Hello everyone, welcome to Yuhan's channel. If you're new here, I'd like to let you know that here we explore Chinese culture and mentalities from a special, authentic perspective. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much. Today we are going to talk about what is the general Chinese attitude toward foreigners, especially toward Westerners. Honestly, before the general attitude Chinese people hold toward foreigners or other ethnic groups wasn't really a question that had crossed my mind. As a Chinese person who has never lived outside of China, these kinds of issues rarely come up in my daily life. You rarely meet foreigners on the street and you rarely have any personal interaction with a foreigner. At least for me, although I lived in Beijing for 15 years, which is supposed to be one of the most international cities, I think I have talked with no more than a handful of foreigners on different occasions over all those years. And now, living in Chengdu, a mega city of 24 million people, I still rarely see foreigners outside. I guess this is a common situation for ordinary Chinese people. That changed when I started dating my husband, who is Spanish. We began encountering some awkward situations, and through him and other foreign friends living in China, I heard more absurd stories. For example, when my husband and his family traveled to smaller towns in China, people would sometimes come up behind them to take photos abruptly or suddenly approach our table in the restaurant to make a toast. If you are not Asian and have visited China, maybe you have experienced something similar. By the way, why do I say if you are not Asian? Because if you look Asian, we can't easily tell whether you are Chinese or not from the first sight. Sometimes people ask if I can tell the difference between Chinese, Japanese, or Korean appearances. I really can't. Usually, when I am with my husband, things are under control and weird situations don't happen too often. But when he is alone or with other foreign friends, for example, in a restaurant or a bar, almost every time some Chinese would come straight to them wanting to talk or drink together out of curiosity or whatever. But I should clarify that they usually go to pretty local places, not like the super elegant or luxury venues. After these experiences, I began to ponder what kind of attitude do we generally hold toward foreigners? I'm basically talking about Westerners here, or more specifically, white people, based on my personal experiences. Where do these attitudes come from, and what are the historical backgrounds? First of all, I would say this is a really complicated and intriguing topic. Some of the historical facts I'm going to discuss next might be a little bit sensitive, or let's mention and charge the term racism. But I need to clarify in advance that I don't think we should use contemporary standards to measure past events. We do need to learn lessons from history. That is exactly why we should study and treasure it. But if we pass rough judgment or apply modern notions to evaluate the past, it is in some ways pointless. I think it's better to first understand objectively where we come from and then reflect rationally on where we are going. So, if you agree with me, let's dive into it. First, who is a foreigner? Generally, it means a person born in or coming from a country other than one's own. That seems quite clear, but in Chinese, within a historical context, it's much more complicated. If you live in China as a foreigner, you are probably familiar with terms like 外国人 or 老外. We will come back to this and other terms still used today. But historically, until the middle of the 19th century, the most commonly used term for foreigners was 夷. Look at the shape of this character. Doesn't it look like a person holding a bow? This character is very ancient, with a history of over 3,000 years. Originally, it meant pacification or suppression, and from this derived meaning related to safety and peace. Because ancient Eastern ethnic groups were skilled in using bows and arrows, Yi also came to refer to these groups. Apart from this character, there were different terms for ethnic groups from various directions and regions. For example, Rong referred to the people from the West. And I am also not an authentic Chinese in a certain sense because where I born, it was not like the middle. So anyway, gradually, Yi began to be used more broadly to refer to people from other places and ethnic groups. In most of the materials I have seen, the word is translated into English as barbarian. I don't entirely agree with this translation, though it is undoubtedly a derogatory term. Its connotation in Chinese is more nuanced. Now we just mentioned there were specific terms for ethnic groups from different directions. That implies there was an assumed center. And you know that China, the country's name in Chinese, 中国, means the nation of the center. So center is really an essential idea in Chinese culture. Then, where is the center? This concept has been fluid throughout history. It is geographical, but more crucially, it is a cultural idea. The center basically refers to the places dominated by the Huaxia people by ancient Chinese Han civilization, the Central Plain civilization. Geographically, it was dynamic. For instance, in Confucius' time, what was considered authentic Chinese culture only covered parts of what are now four provinces, while today we have over 30 provinces. By the way, here is an important note. The term 华人, often translated also as Chinese, is fundamentally an ethnic and culture concept. For example, many people of Chinese descent born in other countries like the States or wherever may not hold Chinese nationality and might never have visited China, but they are still considered 华人 ethnic Chinese. It refers less to nationality and more to culture and ancestry identity. So, if a foreign ethnic group adopted Han civilization, then it would no longer be considered foreign. It could integrate completely. Throughout more than 5,000 years of history, China saw over 50 major dynasties. During this time, its territory continually changed, and the definition of the center was always shifting. However, after the Qin dynasty first unified China in 221 BC, built up a centralized country, a foundation was constructed, meaning the hardcore, the center, had been established, though the center itself could expand or contract over time. These regimes were basically held by Han people and Han civilization. There were some exceptions. The Yuan dynasty, which was from 1271 to 1368, for example, was ruled by Mongols, descendants of Genghis Khan. Theoretically, China was under foreign rule at that time, but they deeply adapted to and integrated with Han culture. As a result, the mainstream culture tradition was not cut off. All of these rulers maintained the continuing idea that they were the common ruler under heaven. This is the concept of the all under heaven state, a political order with a clear center yet blurred peripheries, lacking definitive geographic boundaries. In this view, the center represents civilization and enlightenment, while the peripheries symbolize backwardness and barbarism. We are the celestial empire. The feeling is also a little bit like the ripple metaphor we made when we were discussing 关系, the personal connections, in the previous videos. Then, among foreigners, the Yi people, there were further distinctions. There were inner Yi, such as different ethnic groups within Chinese territory, and outer Yi, depending on how distant or limited contact was. 华夷之辩, the distinction between Huaxia people and Yi, is a classical philosophical topic in ancient Chinese culture, especially in Confucianism. Classical statements expressed this idea in stark terms. For example, the distinction between Hua and Yi was seen as the divide between human and beast, constituting the foremost principle in the realm. It was said that beyond the central flooring scenes, Zhonghua, all directions are inhabited by barbarians. Those relatively closer to the central land retain a trace of human spirit, yet the further they are, the more they become indistinguishable from birds and beasts. Another view holds that the separation between Hua and Yi outweighs the ethical bond between sovereign and subject. The distinction between Hua and Yi is the boundary between human and thing, the paramount principle of the realm. In essence, the Huayi division represented the distinction between civilization and barbarism. But overall, in a very long period, the Westerners were not included in this category because we rarely had any direct contact with them. So, when did Westerners, white people, become classified as E? Interactions between Chinese and Westerners, of course, have a very long history. Like in the Tang Dynasty around the 9th century, Christianity had already arrived in China. Then the most famous account, Marco Polo's travels in the 13th century, opened a new chapter in this exchange. But all of these contacts occurred on a very small scale. Real mass interaction began in the 15th and 16th century. Things happened from then on also fundamentally shaped the mysterious, complex attitude toward foreigners now. From that time onward, white people started to be called "yi," a term used to emphasize their difference and perceived inferiority. The logic was perhaps quite simple. They were too far from the center, they looked very different from us, and some may even have wondered whether they are fully human or perhaps monsters, with far more body hair than we have, or some other distinguished different characters. As the British translator Thomas Taylor Meadows remarked in 1852, the Chinese have indeed become accustomed to calling Europeans barbarians, Yi, and regard them as such. Through the term Yi, they imply that Europeans are rude, savage, and uncivilized in both morality and intellect. The vast majority of the 360 million people believe that we are inferior to their own nation in terms of moral and intellectual civilization. They are often curious, though not shocked, that we too have surnames and make familiar distinctions such as father, brother, wife, and sister. In short, they do not consider us entirely on par with a herd of cattle. However, this arrogant stereotype would soon be shattered. Before we continue, it might be helpful to clarify some key dates to make the timeline easier to follow. So we just mentioned the 15th and 16th centuries, which span two Chinese dynasties, the Ming Dynasty from 1368 to 1644, and the Qing Dynasty from 1636 to 1912, the last feudal dynasty in China. During the early Qing period in the first half of the 17th century, the Netherlands was in its golden age and monopolized the spice trade in Southeast Asia, and Britain established colonies in North America, expanded through the East India Company, and gradually formed a constitutional monarchy. Spain and Portuguese still maintained vast colonial holdings in the Americas and Asia, while China was still in a quite conservative state. And then a major turning point came in 1840 with the First Opium War, which marks the beginning of modern Chinese history. Another pivotal year was 1912, when the Republican Revolution took place and China became a republic. This was followed by the period from 1931 to 1945, encompassing World War II, known in China as the Anti-Japanese War. Finally, 1949 saw the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the communist state that exists today. Though the enduring concept of the all-under heathen state continued to dominate during the Qing dynasty, and the fundamental distinction between Huaxia people and Yi remained, things had already changed significantly. This was because essentially the rulers of the Qing dynasty were Manchu, a minority ethnic group from beyond the Great Wall in the northeast. They were not Han people. Sometimes historically they also be referred as Tartars. As a result, the legitimacy of their rule was questioned for a very long time. The monarchy imposed severe punishments on those who challenged its authority and also carried out extensive cultural campaigns to establish its legitimacy. One of its greatest emperors, Kangxi, famously stated, I view those within and beyond equally, for I consider all people as my children. In nurturing and sustaining them, I make no distinction whatsoever. Here, within refers to China proper, inside the Great Wall, and while beyond refers to the regions outside it. Thus, in a sense, the fundamental definition of Yi and the attitude toward foreigners had already shifted. But when these foreign rulers encountered the actual foreigners we are discussing today, the Westerners, they very smoothly became the orthodox, authentic representatives of China. Regarding the foreign policy of the early Qing dynasty, it is commonly described as a seclusion policy, but more accurately, it should be characterized as opening maritime trade and establishing customs alongside stringent trade regulations. In the early 16th century, European merchants began entering China. In 1757, the Qing government designated Guangzhou as the sole port for foreign trade under the single port trade system. Additionally, they enacted the regulation for preventing foreign incursions, which stipulated that Western merchants were prohibited to spend their winters in Guangzhou, hiring Chinese people, and required them to reside in designated foreign factories, Yanghang. These measures severed direct contact between Western merchants and the Chinese people, imposing segregated management. And overall, it was a distrust attitude towards the Westerners. In contrast, interactions and trade with countries such as Japan, Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam were handled differently, and these nations were part of the tributary system. Of course, these strict restrictions failed to satisfy the foreign merchants, especially the British. After the East India Company gained substantial control over India, its desire to expand trade became increasingly urgent. This set the stage for the most famous and dramatic episode in early Sino-Western relations, Lord George Macartney's embassy to China. This is a famous story in our history textbooks, and I have known roughly what happened since I was young. But while preparing this video, it was the first time I read some original texts about it, such as Lord Macartney's commission and his own descriptions of the journey. They are truly fascinating. In short, this took place at the end of the 18th century. In 1792, when the British King George III appointed Lord George Macartney as his envoy to China. Initially, both sides held quite positive attitudes towards this encounter. However, it did not end well. The British failed to achieve any of their commercial objectives and discovered the country was not as nice as they had imagined. From the Chinese perspective, the Qianlong Emperor believed that the mission had been motivated by admiration for imperial authority and had come to pay homage on his birthday. Yet the British even refused to perform the 3 kneelings and 9 prostrations, the traditional 磕头. This only reaffirmed the belief that the Yi people were not to be trusted. Here are some excerpts from the original texts. In the commission Lord Macartney received, the British proceeded with the premise that they were facing an empire perhaps the most singular on the globe, among whom civilization has existed and the arts have been cultivated through a long series of ages, with fewer interruptions than elsewhere. Lord Macartney was instructed to conduct himself conforming to all ceremonies of that court, which may not commit the honor of your sovereign or lessen your own dignity, so as to endanger the success of your negotiation. The commission further stated that the king was desirous of sending an embassy to the most civilized as well as most ancient and populous nation in the world in order to observe its celebrated institutions and to communicate and receive the benefits which must result from an unreserved and friendly intercourse between that country and his own. When Lord Macartney arrived in China, the scenes he witnessed were indeed impressive. He wrote, "Thus, then, have I seen King Solomon in all his glory. I use this expression as the scene recalled perfectly to my memory a puppet show of that name which I recollect to have seen in my childhood, and which made so strong an impression on my mind that I then thought it a true representation of the highest pitch of human greatness and felicity." Yet he also perceived the signs of weakness beneath the splendor, noting the ground to be hollow under a vast superstructure, and in trees of the most stately and flourishing appearance, I discovered symptoms of speedy decay. But these signs of decay were, of course, completely overlooked by the Chinese monarchy because the Qianlong Emperor perceived the British as disobedient, and following the usual diplomatic strategies of the time, he rejected every single request the English had proposed. In his edict to King George III, he famously stated, "Our celestial emperor possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." Then, about half a century later, the Opium War broke out. The prestige of the Manchu dynasty was utterly humbled by British canons. The illusion of the Celestial Empire's eternal supremacy was shattered, and its barbaric, isolated, and civilization alienated state was broken, opening the way for contact with the outside world. That is written by Karl Marx. Interestingly, in this new narrative, who is barbarian had completely reversed. Immediately following the war, when the British and Qing government were negotiating the Treaty of Nanjing, the British insisted that the derogatory character "yi" be abolished. While it was not explicitly written into the Nanjing Treaty, it was later included in the Treaty of Tianjin. Thus, around 1860, as a rough turning point, the term "yi" was gradually replaced by other terms such as "wai," meaning outside, "xi," meaning west, and "yang," meaning ocean or overseas. "Yi" was still used in some occasions, but the connotation changed. Rather than derogatory feeling, it contained a hint of admiration. For example, a famous intellectual in the early 20th century had a theory of four inferiorities to foreigners. In employing human talent, we are not as effective as foreigners. In utilizing land resources, we are not as efficient as foreigners. In bridging the gap between ruler and people, we are not as successful as foreigners. In ensuring correspondence between them and reality, we are not as thorough as foreigners. We began to realize that we were not as good or as strong as we had believed. In fact, we were extremely weak. The question then became, how could we strengthen ourselves? The only way seemed to be to learn from the West, though to what degree was always hotly debated. One of the most significant reform movements of the late 19th century, led by the Qing government, was literally called the Western Affair Movement, 洋务运动. Then came what we call the Century of Humiliation, when China became a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society, marked by wars, massacres, famine, poverty, and deep national trauma. Throughout this period, foreigners were invariably involved. In one sense, they could be seen as the cause of all of the suffering, yet in many cases, they also appeared as good guys or even saviors. So, for example, Japan in Chinese eyes had long been a smaller country, subordinate to China for centuries, always learning from us. Suddenly, the table turned. We needed to learn from them because it was the closest and most accessible way for Chinese to absorb Western knowledge and modern technology. Many of China's most important revolutionaries, politicians, and intellectuals, like the highly respected writer Lu Xun, studied in Japan. And yet, this same country invaded China with extreme brutality, inflicting immense harm. At the same time, during World War II, especially after Japan attacked the Pearl Harbor, the United States provided significant aid to China. The Chinese Air Force, for instance, was established with American support. The Soviet Union also helped a lot. So these untrustworthy white Westerners could also be helpful. Imagine how confusing this must have been for ordinary Chinese people. Of course, there were many different backgrounds, situations, and cultures at play, but for many, foreigner was just one entity. They didn't necessarily distinguish between a Russian and an American. They were simply white. Of course, there are many more historical facts and different perspectives on this topic, but here I will summarize it in a very personal way. Imagine the country as an individual, a person. This person had a long, rich life inside his own house. He never knew, nor did he particularly want to know, that there might be someone stronger or richer than him, and he didn't realize his own house was slowly collapsing either. His personality, shaped by all these years spent immersed in self sufficient contentment, had become, let's say, a narcissist. Then suddenly and unexpectedly, someone else showed up. This stranger said he wanted to communicate, but also seemed intent on taking advantage. Our person soon realized that he had no real means to resist. This outsider was stronger in many ways. His confidence was shattered. He resented this intruder, yet on the surface he still had to cooperate, even smile at him. He tried to make himself stronger, but sometimes the stranger would help him, other times he would just get in the way, sometimes he would even figuratively spit in his face. And so it went. Psychologically, what kind of feelings might this person develop towards someone so unexpected, so completely different from himself? I can't offer a real psychological analysis here, but I imagine it must be very, very complex. Okay, let's return to the terms we use today to refer to foreigners, as promised at the beginning of the video. First, 外国人. It's fairly neutral, literally meaning a person from another country. It can be used formally in writing or official contexts. But the other term, 老外, is more nuanced. Literally, 老 means old. In daily life, we often use it as a familiar prefix for acquaintances who are not so young, maybe over 40, I guess, paired with their surname, like 老张 or 老王. It carries a light-hearted, friendly tone, somewhat like old Paul or old sport. Y, of course, comes from 外国人, meaning outsider. This term first gained common usage in Taiwan and became popular in mainland China starting in the 1980s. I read a research paper that conducted a scientific data survey, and it suggested that for most Chinese who use this term, it's simply a casual, habitual expression, not meant to be derogatory or negative. However, for many foreigners on the receiving end, it doesn't always feel welcoming. I think their discomfort isn't an overreaction, because intentionally or not, the term does imply that they are fundamentally different than us. It hints at a distance that can make genuine communication or mutual understanding feel difficult. And as we have discussed, the complex collective memory and mixed feelings toward foreigners are still very much alive beneath the surface. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that I personally didn't have much interaction with foreigners before, and even now, in remote or smaller towns across China, many people, especially older generations, may have never seen a foreigner in person. To them, foreigners might exist more as an image, a concept from television, not so different from aliens in a sci fi movie. Yet we are undoubtedly living in a fast globalizing era. Internationalization is an inevitable trend. Still, for many ordinary Chinese, adjusting to this reality may take time to get used to process, and to understand. So perhaps what's needed on all sides is mutual understanding and a little more patience and empathy. All right, that's all for today. Thank you so much for being here with me. As always, please feel free to leave your comments or questions below. I truly look forward to know your idea. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.